Welcome to Canyon Tune, and this is the moment you guys have been waiting for and asked for. We are going to be going over some forced induction tuning today for E36 Siemens MS41 DME, and we're going to cover injector scaling. We're going to cover MAF tuning and what MAF to use for forced induction. And we're going to cover how to log and interpret the logs and apply that to your fueling and timing tables, and kind of going over specifics to this DME because there are a lot of, very specific manufacturer related stuff in the different maps that have to be changed for forced induction. So anytime you do this kind of stuff, more air coming in, you need more fuel, you need less timing, and that just keeps everything safe. So I made this really cool PowerPoint for you guys, and I spent a lot of time on it. So if you could at least like and subscribe and just maybe comment and show me your appreciation for this video, because I spent probably hundreds of hours learning this stuff and making sure that I'm delivering the correct information for you guys so you can do this on your own. An overview of what we're going to be going over. So the first thing is injector scaling. This is how to add bigger injectors to your car because you're adding more fuel. This would apply to adding any kind of injector. So we're going to go over the basics of how you would do that. No matter what manufacturer it is, as long as they fit in your fuel rail, you should be good to go. And then we're going to go over to your mass airflow sensor. We're going to be covering how to use a Nissan slot mass airflow sensor. They're fairly cheap and they are good with higher volumes of airflow. They can be in a blow through or draw through setup, which is kind of nice. And we're going to go over adding resistors, what size MAF housing to use, and how to actually adjust the tables in the ECU to interpret the changes between your stock MAF and the new MAF. Then we're going to go over your ignition timing table and what changes need to happen there so you don't have knock, and changing some of our knock tables to make sure that the DME is still handling knock control at higher load levels. And then lastly is going over fuel tuning, so part throttle and then wide open throttle tuning. I do have a fairly long log from my Supercharger E36 that I just finished that we're going to go over and analyze and show you guys what changes need to be made in the DME to reflect what we saw in the logs. So pretty cool stuff. So let's get into the first part. So injector scaling, okay. Essentially all you're doing to initiate your base maps is you're going to take your old injector flow rate at the same exact fuel pressure. You have to make sure that whatever values you're getting from the internet from your new injectors, they are scaled properly for 0.5 bar or 1 bar or 10 bar of fuel pressure, because the more fuel pressure you add, it's going to change that flow rate. So you want to make sure you're comparing evenly both at 5 bar, what's a flow rate, or 10 bar, whatever it is. So in this example, we have the M3 pink top injectors. These flow at 225 cc's. I believe it's at 5 bar, and my new injectors that I put in are 440 cc injectors. So essentially the first step that we're doing is calculating the percent change between the old injectors and new injectors. So in my case, it's a 95.6% increase in flow rate between the old and new injectors at that specific fuel pressure like I talked about. So what you're going to do is take that 95% increase, and you want to essentially take all of your existing fuel tables, your stock fuel tables, and multiply by that number. So you actually multiply by 1.956, which is 95%. So pretty easy. It's not rocket science. You could add another like 3% fuel to that just to keep things safe, because things don't always scale exactly right or the same way in real life. So let's get into the actual DME tables and walk you through what you would actually modify. This might be a little bit overwhelming to look at first, but tell you it's just sort of rinse and repeat after you figure out the basics. Essentially, what you're going to do is go into the fuel folder here, and you're going to open up the majority of these tables. At the bottom here, you're going to see what these actual values represent. So anytime you see injector pulse width for values inside these tables, those are the values you're going to want to multiply, like I talked about in the last slide, by that value. So there are also tables that are a percent enrichment, because that's a percent on top of your injector pulse width timing. You won't have to modify those tables, which is nice. They automatically scale. So the first thing is you need to go to either the manufacturer's website or try to find information online, but it'll tell you the minimum injector pulse width and the injector dead times. These are going to be specific to your new injectors, so make sure you have that correct. And these, if you don't put anything in for these or scale them correctly and leave them to either your pink or green top injectors for an E36, everything else is going to be thrown off. So these two tables are your basic, most important things. It tells the ECU how the injectors, what kind of delay there is at certain battery voltages and stuff like that. So make sure you get those numbers nailed down. So we can go into, let's say, our cranking fuel table here. Okay, so essentially what you want to do is highlight the whole table, and then we are going to multiply by 1.95. I think there was another number after that, but I'm not going to be exact. And you'd hit the multiply button, so you'll see there's every single number will jump up significantly, almost double. And actually, mine's already tuned, so I'm gonna just undo that. But essentially, that's all you would do to each table, is just multiply by that percent increase for each one of these tables, and then you should be good to go for cranking and your basic injector pulse widths. If you don't know what injector pulse width is, it's every engine cycle, how long in milliseconds your fuel injector is open for. So let's take this value for example right here. This is 3.63 milliseconds per engine cycle that your fuel injector is open for. And this is by engine speed and engine load. We'll get into that in a minute. So just a quick note on the injector scaling. You might not have it correct first pass, it's fine. If the car's not starting or it's way too rich, you may have to mess with that cranking fuel table like I showed you, and just add a little bit of fuel to that at the right coolant temperature. So if it's really cold outside, you might have to add just a little bit of injector pulse width to get that car to start. If it's still not starting, because you have more airflow with forced induction and all your intercooler pipes are hooked up and it's flowing more air, chances are you may need to add a little bit of timing. Usually more air means more timing, so could add a little bit more there to see if that helps, but it should start up at that point. Okay, so now we're going to get into your mass airflow sensor. Stock mass airflow sensor, it's almost flowing its maximum flow rate even with a NA setup. Even if you put cams in it, or M50 manifolds sometimes will max that mass airflow sensor out. So you will most likely be maxed out before you even hit boost in a forced induction application. So to solve this, what you would do is you can run a 540 MAF off of a V8 BMW, but the most common thing to do is to run a Nissan mass airflow sensor. This is a slot style MAF, so it's more resistant to aggressive airflow, especially with a blow-through setup. So a blow-through setup is where you have your MAF housing in the charge pipe or the charged air section of your setup, instead of having a draw-through where the MAF sits at the end of your intake before your compressor, so turbo or supercharger. So a lot of people run these in E36s. They have good success. There's a ton of scaling data out there, and I'll show you because I already have all the scaling information for this thing. There are other options out there. I know the HPX, but some of those MAFs are very expensive and they pretty much do the same thing. One thing you're gonna have to play around with for your specific setup is kind of calculate the max airflow that your turbo or supercharger could potentially put out, and add like a little bit of buffer room to that. But essentially you would need to add a inline resistor for the mass airflow sensor signal. And you can also play around with a MAF sensor housing diameter. Me personally, I'm using a almost 3-inch mass airflow sensor housing, and I ran a 1K resistor, and I actually maxed it out, so I'm going to be switching to a 2.2K resistor. So essentially, all you would have to do to see if you're maxing it out is do a log on mass airflow sensor voltage. It's a 0 to 5 volt reference signal going to your DME, and if you're at 5 volts, you're maxing it out. So you really don't want to be anywhere near that 5 volt. Because when you start maxing stuff out, it can actually go lean, which is bad news. Most DMEs will actually dump fuel if something maxes out, but for some reason, these MS41s like to lean out when they reach their max loads. So be very careful with that and choose this wisely, this setup. Also, the DME, in regard to that, so load is calculated in kilogram per hour. The current max on the DME is 1024 kilogram per hour. You're probably going to max that out at around 10 psi with boost. So if you're running a supercharger setup with like 6-7 pounds with an active auto work setup or something like that, Rotrax unit, a root style blower that's under 10 psi, I mean, you can stay in this mode. But there's actually a way to double your limit by also having all the scaling values. So I'll show you how to do that in a minute. All right, so here we're gonna go over doubling your mass airflow limit or your load limit. So this one can be a little bit tricky, so make sure you both read through the directions in the MAF mode and follow my instructions very carefully, because you can mess this up and potentially brick your ECU. You want to start with reading a full flash from your DME. So this is the full 2056 kilobyte file. And what you're going to see is under sensor scaling, there's not really a lot of stuff you can modify in this when you have the full flash. But you're going to see under sensor scaling, MAF mode, okay? This, you would actually change to this value. So again, step 0, read the current 2056K and open in Realm Raider, select MAF mode 2048, adjust the MAF table, which we can actually do after, but you can do it in this step as well. This table here for the mass airflow scaling. I'll show you that in a minute. And then you would actually read again after you flash it to the ECU, read the partial 24K file, and then tune based on that. So you would not use your old 24K file, or else apparently it gets corrupt, because all the DME logic changes to essentially half all the values and interpret load in a completely different way. So again, make sure when you're coming in here to read all these very carefully and understand what you're doing, because you can really mess things up. All right, so this is for the mass airflow scaling. There is a spreadsheet that a couple folks from the ROM Raider forums put out. And it's this nifty spreadsheet that shows you all of the voltage versus load levels for a bunch of different mass airflow sensors. So you'd open this up in Excel. On the first tab here, you're going to see all these different options. So you can got E36 MAF, M62 MAF, so the 540 MAF, Audi MAF, and then here's your Nissan one I was talking about. So it's really cool. It's all laid out for you. Again, this one seems to work fairly well. So now we're going to get into the actual mass airflow sensor scaling. So we're going to come into the same spreadsheet, and I'll make sure I post a link in the description to all of these, because there's actually 3 spreadsheets for this. So come into the third tab, and the first thing you're going to do is row 11, and where it actually shows the mass airflow sensor name, you can click on that and change which pivot table from the first row it uses. So if you have a different mass airflow sensor that you're using that's in that defined table, you can switch it here, which is kind of nice. Okay, so the main thing you got to figure out, the mass airflow sensor diameter needs to match in this stock size column. So whatever is stock Nissan MAF 2.76, make sure these numbers match, because sometimes they don't, and this doesn't change automatically based on the pivot table. So make sure that's correct. Divisor and multiplier keep the same. Tube size inside diameter is the size in inches that you would have for your mass airflow sensor housing. So for example, mine is 2.9 inches, so make sure you enter it there. And try to be as exact as possible. So even if you need a micrometer to measure the inside diameter of your tube, make sure that's all good. And then resistor value is whatever inline resistor you're using for that 5-volt reference signal. So in my case, I'm actually using a 2.2. So you'd actually change this to 2200. And then what's cool is it actually scales all of this based on your values here. So if you are thinking you're going to max out the mass airflow sensor or need to play around with these settings, go ahead and change them in the spreadsheet, and then come down to your 5-volt area here in green. So mine, the way it's set up with a diameter and resistor at 5 volts, we're at 2,600 kilograms per hour, which is a serious amount of air. I think that's probably gonna be in like the 800-900 horsepower range worth of air. So I don't think I'll ever get anywhere close to that, but it's good to make sure you have some headroom. But make sure you don't go too crazy with your resistor value, because you do lose sensitivity at the lower end, and that has to do a lot with drivability, throttle tip-in. So you could have some weird issues if you go too crazy with that resistor, so just be careful. So next, after you got all that figured out, you can actually copy this selection or table right here. Make sure you get that selection 3D at the top, because ROM Raider needs that to format the table property. So copy that, come over to ROM Raider, and you would actually open up your 2048 table, even though you may be using 1024 mode, and paste the values in. So if you're using 2048 mode, keep these values how they are pasted in. But if you're still in 1024 mode, you actually have to multiply these values by 2. I messed that up in mine, and how I knew about it was if you go into the table properties, it says a little note right here that the values will read twice as high as actual. So make sure you multiply those. And you can actually verify that by opening up this 1024-2056 table. It's quite long, so you have to sit there and scroll. But you can come in and verify at, a certain value here that it matches whatever was in your original spreadsheet to verify that that's all good. because that at the end of the day should show the correct values. After you scale the MAF and your injectors, the last thing you're gonna do is come into fuel and ignition timing axis and modify your load axis. So mine isn't still in the 1024 mode, so mine only goes up to that high. But essentially you would modify this whole table to go up to 2048 or whatever possible maximum load value. One thing you have to do anytime you modify this table is edit your scaling, save it, and then it will finally reflect in your actual fuel table correctly. So this table here corresponds to your fuel injection axis here. So stock, I think this only goes up to like 300 or 400. So you're gonna modify your load axis and then it'll reflect the same exact values going up. Okay, so now that we gave ourselves some headroom with bigger injectors and a mass airflow sensor that can read some more air and a DME that can accept higher load values, we're ready to get started with ignition timing. There was a formula out there somewhere, and I wish I could find it again. I can't find it for some reason, but essentially they were saying that anything over 600 kilogram per hour is actually positive pressure and outside of vacuum. So a general rule of thumb is for every PSI of boost, you need to remove 1 to 2 degrees of timing from your timing table. And it's better to start with less timing than more, because you don't want knock and you don't want to blow a head gasket or blow up your engine, because anytime there's pre-detonation, you're going to get crazy high cylinder pressures and blow that head gasket right out. So this little chart here is some of the values that I came up with. So at 750 kg per hour, I took like around 3.6 degrees of timing out of the table. At around 900, 7 degrees, and 1050, 10 degrees. So you can kind of scale that upwards if you're, higher boost than 10 psi. So like around 1050, I'm making like around 10 psi. Again, there's a formula to work out kilogram per hour to boost. It's not exactly an exact science, but I would stay on the more cautious side, probably more around 2 degrees than 1 degree per PSI. So this is just kind of a reiteration. If you haven't watched my last videos, you would actually come into ignition timing base, and don't go by this one. I'm still working on my ignition timing table. I had a bunch of knock because my fueling wasn't correct, so don't really mind that. But essentially I left anything under 600 kind of stock ignition timing, and after that I got pretty aggressive with reducing that timing. Just remember that when you increase engine speed, you're also increasing your ignition timing with or without boost. So it's more of a curve than a flat, like linear thing. So again, your curve is probably set pretty close from the factory of what it's supposed to be. So kind of go from 600 up and just scale that down and reduce some of those values. Just make sure the first drive out that you're logging knock, or you can see it really well on your laptop when you're driving or on a dyno. As soon as you get into the throttle a little bit, into boost, if it starts knocking, get out of it, because you obviously have too much timing or your fueling might be off and you're getting some considerable knock there. This last segment, we're gonna get into fuel tuning. We're actually gonna start with part throttle fuel tuning. So there is a table in the DME that tells whether it's a wide open throttle and it needs wide open throttle enrichment versus part throttle just cruising, and that's all based on narrowband sensors and your short-term fuel trims. So one thing is, obviously, if you're tuning a turbo car, you definitely need a wideband O2 sensor, and those values are imported into your computer, and you can log all that information at the same time and make, you know, the proper edits to meet your wide open throttle fueling. So I have two spreadsheets for that, a part throttle one and a full throttle, and I'll show you based on logs how to build your fuel table pretty quickly. First thing you have to understand and turn off before you do any kind of fuel tuning based on logs is you need to come in here to fuel injection base, Vanos correction, just zero out this table. It just skews your data because it adds a multiplier based on Vanos. We're going to completely shut that down. And then there is a open loop enrichment table. So this is actually a percentage. Past a certain throttle percentage, it's going to add a bunch of fuel, and we don't want that right now because we want to dial in our base fuel injection table. So again, zero all that out. There is also a open loop detection map. I usually set this as low as like 30% TPS, just because if you're more than 30% throttle, it's going to automatically go into this enrichment table and ignore the short-term fuel trim correction. So if you want to go nice and rich in boost, you have to lower this percentage, or else it's going to just try and correct and take away up to 25% fuel that you're trying to add on top of your 14.7 to 1 that it's trying to correct to. So you're fighting the ECU at that point. So make sure you have these values pretty low so it activates open loop enrichment. But again, I don't do anything with this table because it's a percentage additive fuel, and it's very hard to get that dialed in based on a lot of factors. So I'll essentially richen up my actual fuel table and base everything off of that instead of enrichment. And I know of a lot of different people that do it this way. Some people go by enrichment, some people go all based on the fuel table. I just find it easier this route. There are a bunch of different ways to do this, but with the help of Megalog Viewer HD, I think the program is around 40 bucks, but it's well worth the price. It helps you get the fuel dialed in very, very quickly. So essentially what you do is go into your ROM Raider logger, log, you know, your standard RPM, TPS, IATs, ignition timing, knock, load, your mass airflow sensor reading, mass airflow voltage, and the most important part is your short-term fuel trims 1 and 2, and of course TPS, you know, RPM. It's basically everything you think you're gonna need, turn on and log. It's better to have more data than less. So what I do is open up a nice long log in Megalog Viewer. And again, we're doing part throttle first. So try not to get into boost. Try to log for quite a bit of time, because the more data you have to work with, the better you're gonna dial in that fuel table. So this is the actual log viewer. This is my entire log. It's a pretty big file that I have here. But the really cool thing is you can build fueling tables based on this data that you have. In order to set this up, you need to set your RPM scaling to match exactly what you have in ROM Raider. So see right here, matches. And then your load values, you also want to scale this load axis to the same as your load axis in ROM Raider. And you can just do that by clicking on the value and changing it. It's pretty easy. And then you have to make sure that you set up the axis correctly. I had mine flipped the other way because this looks like the 0 point. So start with the lowest RPM at the top and then go higher, and then lowest load on this side, and like that. Your x-axis is going to be load. Your y-axis is going to be RPM, just like it is in the ROM Raider logger. And then your z-axis is going to be your short-term fuel trims, bank 1 and 2. You can, I think, somehow average these together. I guess you can look at the raw data and average those together, but one of the banks is probably fine unless you have some sort of weird misfire on one of the banks and it's not reading the correct value. So again, this is a percent correction that the ECU, based on the narrowband sensors, the stock narrowband sensors, is correcting. So you could see here, I mean, this table is kind of all over the place. I was playing around with some different stuff, but the ECU is reporting at this load in this RPM that it's lacking 10% fuel. Once you have all this data, it should be fairly filled in. If it's not, you can actually go out to and press the brake and gas at the same time in the car and load it up more to simulate higher load situations to try and hit all these cells. But the more data that you have filled in, the better. So essentially what you would do is copy all these values. You're going to come into fuel trim part throttle, and this is a really cool spreadsheet. You're going to paste in from Megalog viewer in this green box whatever your corrective fuel trims are, okay? And I actually pasted this in already. And this is the multiplier that it would use to get the correct numbers based on the correction factor. And you can see that above 350 load, it's basically turned off. So again, we're only tuning part throttle here, so just keep that in mind. So after these are pasted in from your Megalog viewer, you would come in and also paste in the fuel table from ROMRater. So come into ROMRater, get your fuel injection table, say copy table, and paste it into here. And then it actually builds a new fuel table for you based on what the ECU has been correcting over time. So after you paste this in and have enough data, you should be within 5% correction factor and really have that part throttle fuel table dialed in. So this new fuel table to ROMRater, again, select this whole thing. Make sure you select your 3D table value as well, because it won't paste properly. And then come back here, paste it into your base fuel injection, and then you're good to go. The other thing that's kind of cool is it will show you how much it changed the values. So on mine, for example, I was running pretty lean in the lower load, lower RPM, so I added a bunch of fuel there. And then it took away a bit of fuel in the higher RPM. So pretty neat little trick to get yourself, have that fuel table dialed in. Otherwise, if you were to do all this by hand, it would probably take forever. You could also see that, you know, it's multiplying the multiplier versus the fuel trims that's reporting in your original values to get the desired fuel table values. So pretty neat trick. Now we're gonna get into wide open throttle fueling. Again, make sure you have your open loop enrichment set to around 30%, because you don't want to have the DME taking away a bunch of fuel if you're targeting like 11:1 air fuel ratio and boost. That's bad news. It's trying to lean it out. This took me a while to figure out. It's like the ECU, you know, always wants to keep everything at 14.7:1 to make it fuel efficient. So it's always going to try to correct. So this table here is actually how you would disable that. In an ideal world, in most standalones, it's load based and not TPS based. So that's why I keep this these values pretty low. And you can experiment with this too. And this is what changes from open loop to closed loop. All right, so you would go back out and do some logging and make sure that you have your wideband sensor also hooked up there. So here's my wideband, and I got some data coming in from it. And then you're actually going to just use the same histogram table generator and just change your z-axis to your wideband values, okay? So here you can see that, you know, I was a little bit lean in this area, and in boost, still a little bit lean, a little bit too rich here. And one thing I've noticed too is that you have to filter out some of that data from the wideband, because when you let off throttle, it'll go straight to like 22 air fuel ratio. So you can actually come in here and create filters, and I think I created a couple. So I have like off throttle, AFR out of range. So anything that's above 20 or below 10, it just filters that data out. So you actually get the correct data that's actually in the range of wide open throttle. You can even go as far as filtering out that's anything below 30% TPS, because you want to focus on that wide open throttle enrichment area. So we're coming back here. We're gonna again copy this data, and just like our other spreadsheet, we're gonna come to this fuel trim wide open throttle table instead. So this one is really cool to get dialed in. In a boosted car, you want to make sure that your air fuel ratios are nice and rich in boost. So this is actually sort of set up fairly good, and you can actually scale this based on if you need to go higher than that. So this is targeting, you know, 11.6 air fuel ratio at higher loads, which is good, keeping things nice and safe. You can go lower than that. And then lower loads, you know, 14.7, that's good for gas mileage, and there's like a little transition area. So this is where you set up your air fuel ratio targets, and then paste in your wide open throttle AFR readings from Megalog viewer. So that's what we have. Paste those in here in the green area. And then again, it figures out the multiplier of what it reported. So let's say 10.6 AFR in this cell, and we need to get to 11. It leaned it out a little bit in this area. So in this area, it was targeting 11, and we are reading like 13s. So again, it added a bunch of fuel here, like 20%. So this is a really good way to get your wide open throttle stuff dialed in boost, and make sure you have the correct fuel table set up. So again, paste in your original fuel table here from ROMRater, and then your new fuel table will be generated based on what you got from your logs, and then paste her in, and then you're good to go. Some stuff that I've done is I've created another tab and did a mashup of my part throttle versus like full throttle, because I didn't want to change my part throttle work that I did. So I just took the higher load and changed my values based on that. There's a table in here for, and I actually had this issue where my car was stalling out. Anytime I would let off the throttle and come to a stop. That's fairly standard with boosted cars. So some of the stuff that I changed coming in here, there's like rapid engine speed drop table, detection of rapid engine speed drop, intercept RPM. So if you look at the table properties of all these, it tells you exactly what all these tables do. And if you're questioning, you know, some of these tables, again, you can come in here. Most of this stuff is spelled out exactly what it does, so there's no second guessing. This one's a little bit complicated, but this specific one helped my stalling out issue coming off throttle. So if engine speed is less than this value, allow intercept mode to be activated. The intercept function is generally used to calculate and promote smooth transition from decel engine to idle. So that will help with coming back down to idle and stopping it from doing weird stuff. There's also idle speed regulation. I didn't really touch much of that. Idle speed control, I think I left most of that the same. But again, you can come in here and read what all these tables do and really dial in the car based on some of that stuff. I think that's gonna do it for this episode. I might have a follow-up episode of really fine-tuning stuff and getting it to run perfect. I'm actually still working on my car and learning things myself, so as I get through it, I will update you guys. That should be the basics for your ignition and fueling and getting that dialed in as fast as possible. Again, Megalog Viewer is a really nice tool. And actually it can do scatter plots too. So if you have MAF versus MAF voltage and hits, draws this really nice curve, and you can get your MAF scaling based on that. And one other thing that you could do too is if you have knock. So this is the maximum amount of knock retard that the ECU is pulling. So again, you can copy this whole table right into ROM Raider and pull a bunch of timing in your timing table. I had some pretty severe knock at the top here mainly because it was my fueling, but make sure you have your fueling correct before you start, saying, is this really knock or is it because of a lean condition? But this can help you with your ignition table as well. So if you're seeing all zeros, great, you might be able to bump up timing. But if you're seeing a whole bunch of areas where it's pulling timing, copy these and then pull that same amount of timing in your actual ignition timing map. And as long as your axis is set up the same as ROM Raider, you can copy and paste back and forth and then really dial this stuff in super quick. You don't have to sit there, go through every column and type all this stuff in. It makes it a lot faster. So if you guys have any questions, just post in the comments and I'll try to get to it. I know there might be a lot of questions because some of the stuff is fairly complicated, but I did want to make a forced induction video. And again, I'm not making any money off of this, so if you could at least like and subscribe to my YouTube channel, it doesn't cost you guys anything, just a second of your time, that would be great. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more tuning videos and build videos and all kinds of crazy stuff. I got lots of stuff planned for the channel. Thanks, guys.